They found 17 bodies in the cellar beneath the social club on Kedzie Avenue. The concrete floor had been poured over them in sections, like a jigsaw puzzle of unmarked graves. Some had been there for months, others for years. The Cook County coroner would later note that several of the victims showed signs of torture before death. Broken fingers arranged in unnatural angles, teeth extracted without anesthesia, burn marks that suggested prolonged suffering. But what disturbed the investigators most wasn't the bodies themselves. It was the journal they found tucked inside a false panel in the wall, written in a woman's elegant cursive, documenting every name, every date, every scream that echoed through that basement between 1949 and 1951. The entries were clinical, methodical, horrifying in their precision, and at the bottom of the final page, a single sentence: "They never believed a woman could remember." The question that haunted Chicago for decades wasn't who killed those men. The families knew, the police knew, even the newspapers knew, though they'd never print it. The real mystery was how she did it. How did Vivian Rossi, a 32-year-old woman with nothing but a grade school education and a face that launched 1,000 whispers, orchestrate the complete annihilation of the Battaglia crime family, one of the most feared operations in Chicago, without firing a single bullet herself? To understand how a mistress became an executioner, how a woman dismissed as decorative became the architect of the most brutal purge in Chicago mob history, we must go back to a frigid February night in 1949, to a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, where Vivian Rossi first walked through the doors of Sal Battaglia's domain and into a nightmare she couldn't yet imagine. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through the city like a knife that February, turning the streets into tunnels of frozen breath and dirty snow. Vivian Rossi stood in the lobby of the Lakeshore Towers, smoothing the wrinkles from her borrowed coat, not truly borrowed, taken from the closet of the woman she cleaned houses for on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The coat was navy wool with a fox fur collar, and it made her look like she belonged in places she'd only scrubbed on her hands and knees. She was 29 then, with dark hair that fell in waves to her shoulders, and green eyes that seemed to shift between emerald and grey, depending on the light. Men looked at her. They always had. But Vivian had learned early that being looked at and being seen were entirely different things. The elevator operator, an older black man named Joseph who'd worked the building for 15 years, gave her a knowing look as she stepped into the brass cage. "Penthouse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Girls like Vivian only came to the Lakeshore Towers for one floor. "Penthouse," she confirmed, her voice steady despite the acceleration of her heartbeat. She'd been told what to expect. Gina Marcello, who worked the coat check at the Stardust Lounge and owed her life to Vivian's intervention during an argument with a drunk regular, had made the introduction. "Sal Battaglia's looking for a new companion," Gina had whispered over coffee at a diner on Halsted Street. "Not a wife. His wife's got the house in Oak Park and the respectability. He wants someone for the city apartment, someone elegant, someone who can keep her mouth shut and her ears open." The last part, Gina had emphasized with a squeeze of Vivian's hand, was crucial. "You'll hear things, Viv. Things that could get you killed or set you up for life. Just remember which side your bread's buttered on." The elevator rose through the building's 23 floors with mechanical precision, and Vivian used the time to steady herself. She'd grown up in the same neighborhood as Sal Battaglia, back when they were both just Italian kids in the tenements west of Halsted, before the war changed everything. She remembered him as a teenager, already cold-eyed and calculating, already marked for something darker than the factory work that broke his father's back. They'd never spoken. He was 5 years older, and those 5 years might as well have been a century in the rigid social hierarchy of Depression-era Chicago. But she remembered, and she wondered if he would remember her. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer, and Vivian stepped into a world that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. The entry hall was all marble and mirrors, with a crystal chandelier that cast fractured light across the polished floors. The air smelled of leather and expensive cologne, undercut by something else. Cigar smoke and a metallic tang she couldn't quite place, but that made her think of the stockyards on summer days. "Miss Rossi." The voice came from a man who materialized from a doorway to her left, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the flattened nose of a boxer and eyes that catalogued everything about her in a single sweep. "I'm Carlo Benedetti, Mr. Battaglia's assistant. You're expected." She followed him through the penthouse, past a living room furnished with uncomfortable-looking modern furniture and abstract paintings that seemed to mock anyone who tried to find meaning in their chaotic patterns. The apartment was a monument to new money, trying desperately to look like old money and failing. Everything was too clean, too perfect, too obviously expensive. It lacked the worn comfort of inherited wealth, the easy confidence of people who'd never had to prove anything. Sal Battaglia was waiting in what he called his study, a wood-paneled room dominated by a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. He stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the black water and the lights of Navy Pier in the distance. He was smaller than Vivian remembered, perhaps 5'7", with a compact build that suggested coiled power rather than bulk. His hair was still thick and dark, slicked back with pomade, and he wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Vivian had earned in the past year of scrubbing other people's floors and ironing other people's linens. "Leave us," Battaglia said without turning, and Carlo withdrew silently, closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt final. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Vivian knew better than to speak first. This was a test, a game, and the only way to win was to refuse to play. She stood still, hands folded in front of her, and waited. Finally, Battaglia turned. His face was what people called handsome if they were being generous. Strong jaw, prominent nose, dark eyes that missed nothing. But there was a hardness to his features that made them difficult to look at directly, as if staring too long might reveal something you'd spend the rest of your life wishing you hadn't seen. "You're from the neighborhood," he said. It wasn't a question. "Taylor Street," Vivian confirmed. "We left when I was 16. My mother got work at a hotel in Evanston. She thought it would be better for us." "Was it?" "No." The corner of Battaglia's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of honesty he appreciated. "Your friend Gina says you can be trusted." "I don't trust easily, Miss Rossi. The world's full of people who talk too much, who think loyalty is something you can turn on and off like a faucet. You understand what I'm offering here?" "A position," Vivian said carefully. "As a companion. A position as my mistress," Battaglia corrected, and Vivian felt the weight of the word settle over her like a heavy coat. "I have a wife, Constance. She's a good Catholic woman who gave me 2 sons and maintains my household in Oak Park. She knows her place, and she's content with it. What I need here in the city is someone different, someone who can accompany me to dinners, to meetings at the club, to places where Constance wouldn't be appropriate. Someone who understands that discretion isn't just a virtue, it's a survival skill." He moved closer and Vivian forced herself not to step back. "You'll have an apartment, not here, somewhere nearby. You'll have an allowance, a clothing budget, everything you need to look the part. In exchange, you'll be available when I need you. You'll smile at the right people, you'll pour drinks, you'll be charming and forgettable. And most importantly," he paused, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl, "you'll be deaf, dumb, and blind to anything you might see or hear while you're in my company. Can you do that?" Vivian thought of her mother, dying slowly in a charity ward from the cancer eating through her lungs. She thought of the 3-room apartment she shared with 2 other women, the constant hustle to make rent, the bone-deep exhaustion of scrubbing floors until her hands cracked and bled. She thought of all the times men had looked at her and seen nothing but a body to be used and discarded. At least this man was honest about what he wanted. "I can do that," she said. Battaglia nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. "Good. Carlo will handle the details. You'll start next week. There's a dinner at the Drake Hotel. Some businessmen from St. Louis who need to be impressed. You'll wear something elegant. Red, I think. You look good in red." He turned back to the window, a clear dismissal. Vivian started toward the door, her hand on the handle when his voice stopped her. "Miss Rossi?" "One more thing." She turned back. "People in my line of work don't believe in accidents. If you betray me, if you talk to the wrong person, if you even think about going to the police or the newspapers—" He paused, and when he smiled, it was the coldest thing Vivian had ever seen. "They won't find enough of you to fill a shoebox. We clear?" "Crystal," Vivian said, and walked out before her trembling hands could betray her fear. In the elevator, descending back toward the world she knew, Joseph the operator met her eyes in the brass reflection. "So you okay, miss?" "Fine," Vivian lied, because fine was the only acceptable answer. Just fine. But that night, alone in her narrow bed in the apartment that always smelled of cabbage and mildew, Vivian Rossi made herself a promise. She would play the role Sal Battaglia wanted. She would be the perfect mistress, decorative and empty-headed, a pretty bauble he could show off and then forget. But she would watch. She would listen. And she would remember everything. Because sooner or later, men like Sal Battaglia made mistakes. And when they did, the women they'd underestimated would be ready. She just didn't know yet that her revenge would leave 17 bodies in a basement and transform her from victim into the most feared name whispered in Chicago's underworld. Spring came to Chicago like a reluctant guest, cold and wet and gray. Vivian settled into her new life with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival depended on perfect performance. The apartment Battaglia provided was in a brick building on Astor Street, just off the Gold Coast, a one-bedroom with hardwood floors and windows that overlooked a courtyard where wealthy residents walked their expensive dogs. It was furnished with tasteful anonymity, a navy sofa, cream curtains, a bed with a quilted coverlet that reminded Vivian of hotel rooms she'd cleaned. Nothing personal, nothing that suggested a real person lived there, which was, she understood, entirely the point. Carlo Benedetti handled the logistics of her new existence with the efficiency of someone managing inventory. Every Monday, an envelope appeared in her mailbox containing $500 in cash, more money than Vivian had ever held at one time. For clothes, hair, whatever you need to look the part, Carlo explained during their second meeting. Keep the receipts. Mr. Battaglia likes to know where his money goes. There was a dressmaker on Oak Street, a Hungarian woman named Mrs. Kovacs, who specialized in the kind of elegant simplicity that whispered money rather than shouting it. A hairdresser on Michigan Avenue who transformed Vivian's natural waves into the sleek, controlled style favored by the women in Vogue magazine. A jeweler who provided her with paste copies of expensive pieces. Real diamonds get stolen, Carlo explained. Fakes get you the same look without the worry. Battaglia called for her twice, sometimes 3 times a week, usually evenings, sometimes late nights that stretched into early morning. He would send a car, a black Cadillac with a driver named Frank who never spoke beyond "Good evening, Miss Rossi," and she would arrive wherever she was needed: the pump room at the Ambassador Hotel, a private dining room at Henrice's, the social club on Kedzie Avenue, where men in expensive suits conducted business in back rooms while their wives believed they were playing cards. Her role was exactly as Battaglia had described, ornamental and invisible. She would sit beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and smile at the right moments. She learned to nurse a single glass of champagne through an entire evening, keeping her mind sharp while appearing pleasantly intoxicated. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny and nodded through conversations she wasn't supposed to understand. She was the perfect accessory, beautiful, compliant, forgettable. Except she wasn't forgetting anything. The men who populated Battaglia's world thought women like Vivian were decoration, no different than the crystal chandeliers or the oil paintings on the walls. They spoke freely in front of her, discussing things that would have horrified their wives and interested the district attorney immensely. She heard about the numbers racket on the South Side, the protection money collected from shopkeepers on Taylor Street, the unions that had been convinced to support certain political candidates. She heard names, judges, aldermen, police captains, followed by amounts of money that made her monthly allowance look like pocket change. She heard about problems that needed to be handled and associates who'd had accidents. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear, and Vivian remembered everything. At first, it was simply a defense mechanism. If something happened to her, if she disappeared like the girls whispered about in the beauty parlor, she wanted someone to know where to look. She started keeping a journal, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Good Housekeeping cookbook that no one would think to examine. She recorded dates, names, fragments of conversation. She developed her own shorthand, a personal code that would mean nothing to anyone who stumbled across it, but allowed her to reconstruct entire evenings from a few scrawled notations. But as the months passed and spring turned to summer, something shifted in Vivian's motivation. She began to see patterns in the chaos of Battaglia's operations. She began to understand the structure of his organization, the hierarchy, the rivalries, the alliances built on fear rather than loyalty. And she began to realize that for all their power, for all their violence and swagger, The men who ran Chicago's underworld were deeply, profoundly stupid about certain things. They were stupid about women. They dismissed them as weak, emotional, incapable of understanding the brutal mathematics of organized crime. They never considered that a woman might be watching, cataloguing, waiting. They were stupid about their own mortality. They believed themselves untouchable, protected by money and muscle, and the unwritten rule that bosses died of old age in their beds, not bullets in back alleys. They strutted through the world like immortal gods, never imagining that empires built on blood could just as easily drown in it. And they were catastrophically stupid about Battaglia himself. Vivian saw what they missed because she had the advantage of proximity and dismissal. She saw how Battaglia watched his own men with the cold calculation of someone always measuring loyalty against liability. She saw how he never forgot a slight, no matter how small, and how his retribution always came unexpectedly, sometimes years after the offense. She saw that he was brilliant and paranoid and utterly devoid of anything resembling human empathy. She also saw that he was cruel in ways that went beyond business necessity. It was late July when she witnessed what would become the catalyst for everything that followed. Battaglia had invited her to a private dinner at the penthouse. Unusual, as he typically kept his city apartment and his social engagements separate. When Vivian arrived, she found him hosting 3 of his capos: Tommy the Hammer Rizzo, a thick-necked enforcer with hands like canned hams; Paulie Greco, who ran the gambling operations; and Marco Santini, the youngest of the group, barely 30, handsome in a sleek, dangerous way that reminded Vivian of a straight razor. The dinner was tense from the beginning. The men picked at their food, veal piccata prepared by Battaglia's private chef, and drank heavily, speaking little. Vivian sat at the end of the table playing her usual role, when Battaglia suddenly shifted the conversation. "Gentlemen, I want to discuss a personnel matter," he said, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. "It's come to my attention that we have a leak. Someone's been talking to that reporter at the Tribune, the one who's been writing about labor racketeering." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Vivian watched as the 3 capos exchanged glances, each man's face carefully blank, but their body language screaming tension. "We've conducted an investigation," Battaglia continued, his voice pleasant and conversational. "Discreet inquiries, process of elimination, and we've identified the source of the problem." He gestured to Carlo, who'd been standing silently by the door. Carlo moved forward and placed a manila envelope on the table in front of Marco Santini. "Marco," Battaglia said gently, almost sadly, "you want to tell us why you've been meeting with Peter Caldwell every Thursday afternoon at that coffee shop on State Street?" Santini's face went white. "Sal, I swear, it's not—" "Don't insult me with lies." Battaglia's voice remained soft, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "We have photographs, transcripts. You've been spilling everything. Names, numbers, locations. What I can't figure out is why. You've done well with us. You're making good money. Your mother has that nice house in Cicero. Your sister's kids go to private school. Why would you risk all that?" Santini's hands were shaking. Vivian watched, frozen, as the young man's face cycled through denial, fear, and finally a desperate kind of defiance. "Because I'm sick of it," he said quietly. "Sick of the violence. Sick of watching us squeeze money out of people who can barely afford to eat. My sister's husband works at that factory on Fullerton. You know, the one where Paulie's boys collect protection money every week. He had to take on a second job just to make the payments. I'm funding my own nephew's suffering. That's not a business. It's a disease." The room was silent. Even Tommy Rizzo, who Vivian had seen break a man's arm for spilling a drink, looked uncomfortable. There was something in Santini's confession that resonated, a glimpse of the conscience these men worked so hard to bury. Battaglia nodded slowly, as if Santini had just confirmed something disappointing but expected. "I understand," he said. "Truly, I do. But you understand what I have to do now." "Please," Santini whispered. "Sal, please. I'll leave. I'll go to California, Florida, anywhere. I'll never come back. Just let me live." "I can't do that, Marco. You know I can't. Men need to know that there are rules. Break those rules and there are consequences." Battaglia stood, smoothing his tie. "Take him to the club," he instructed Carlo. "Use the basement. Make it last. I want him to have time to really think about his choices." It took Vivian a moment to understand what she'd just heard. Make it last. Not a quick bullet, not a clean death. Something prolonged, something designed to maximize suffering. Carlo and Tommy grabbed Santini, who didn't fight, what was the point, and dragged him toward the door. As they passed Vivian, Santini's eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that moment she saw something that would haunt her for years. A desperate plea for help from someone who knew no help was coming. The door closed behind them. Battaglia sat back down, poured himself more wine, and looked at Paulie Greco. "I'll need you to take over Marco's operations. Clean house. Anyone who was close to him needs to be watched." "Of course," Greco said, his voice steady despite the beads of sweat on his forehead. "Good." Battaglia turned to Vivian, his expression shifting into something approximating warmth. "I apologize for the unpleasantness, Cara. Business sometimes intrudes on social occasions. Would you like dessert?" The chef prepared tiramisu, and that was when Vivian understood that she wasn't living among criminals. She was living among monsters. And the biggest monster of all sat across from her, calmly eating dessert, while a young man was being tortured to death in a basement across town. Later that night, back in her apartment on Astor Street, Vivian added Marco Santini's name to her journal. She didn't know then that it would be the first of 17 names. She didn't know that she was documenting not just crimes, but evidence that would eventually become a roadmap to Battaglia's destruction. But she knew she was no longer just surviving. She was preparing. The question was for what? August arrived with suffocating humidity that turned Chicago into an open-air furnace. The heat made people irritable and stupid, Battaglia told her one sweltering evening at the social club on Kedzie Avenue. It made them confess things they should keep hidden, made them sloppy with their routines, made them forget that walls had ears and shadows had eyes. Vivian had been to the club a dozen times by then, a nondescript brick building sandwiched between a Polish butcher shop and a shoe repair place, with windows that were always shuttered, and a door that only opened if the man inside the speakeasy-style slot recognized your face. The ground floor was designed for legitimacy: card tables, a small bar, leather chairs where neighborhood men gathered to read Italian newspapers and complain about their wives. But the real business happened in the back rooms, and Vivian was beginning to suspect. In the basement that no one mentioned but everyone knew existed. It was during one of those August nights that Vivian first heard the sounds. She was sitting in Battaglia's usual booth, red leather positioned to oversee the entire main room, while he conducted a meeting in the private dining room with someone Carlo had described only as an associate from Detroit. Vivian had learned to make herself useful during these waiting periods. She would chat with the bartender, a grandfather named Enzo who'd worked for Battaglia's father back in the Prohibition days. She would smile at the soldiers who nodded respectfully as they passed. She would flip through magazines and sip soda water and embody patient, decorative compliance. That night, Enzo was in the back changing a keg. The few men in the main room were absorbed in a poker game, their attention focused on the cards and the growing pile of cash in the center of the table. And that's when Vivian heard it. A sound so faint, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. A muffled thump, like something heavy dropping. Then silence. Then another thump, followed by something that might have been a voice, distorted by distance and concrete. She froze, her magazine forgotten. The sounds were coming from below her, beneath the floorboards, underground. The basement. Later, piecing together the timeline, Vivian would realize it had been exactly 1 week since Marco Santini disappeared. No one had seen him. His mother had filed a missing persons report with the police, who'd made sympathetic noises and done nothing. The newspapers hadn't covered it. Another young Italian man vanishing in a city where young Italian men vanished with depressing regularity wasn't news. But Marco hadn't vanished. He was beneath her feet, in a basement that wasn't supposed to exist, experiencing something Vivian's imagination couldn't quite conjure. But her nightmares tried. The meeting ended. Battaglia emerged looking satisfied, shook hands with a thin man in an expensive suit who avoided making eye contact with anyone, and then guided Vivian toward the exit. As they reached the door, Carlo appeared with a set of keys. "The situation downstairs," Carlo said quietly. "It's concluded," Battaglia nodded. "Clean it up. Use the usual method." Usual method. Vivian didn't ask. She'd learned that questions marked you as someone who didn't understand how this world worked, but she filed those 3 words away in the mental catalogue that she transcribed into her journal every night, each entry building a repository of horror that grew heavier with every passing week. Over the next 3 months, the sounds from the basement became a recurring nightmare. Not constant. Sometimes weeks would pass in relative silence, but then there would be another muffled session of thumps and impossible to identify noises, and Vivian would sit upstairs, smiling and sipping her drink and dying inside, as she understood that someone was suffering beneath her feet, and she was powerless to stop it. The not knowing was its own special torture. She would see men disappear, associates who fell out of favor, soldiers who made mistakes, outsiders who crossed invisible lines, and wonder if they ended up in that basement. Sometimes she'd spot their names in the obituaries weeks later, attributed to accidents or sudden illnesses. Sometimes they simply dissolved into absence, their families left to wonder and mourn without closure. In October, she witnessed a conversation that crystallized her understanding of the basement's purpose. 2 of Battaglia's enforcers, drinking heavily at the bar after what they thought was a successful collection run, spoke too loudly about their boss's methods. "The thing about Sal," one of them said, a man named Vincent with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, "is he understands psychology. Quick death? That's a waste. Guy's scared for maybe 2 seconds, then it's over. But you make it last. You make them really think about what they did. That's when fear becomes useful, word gets around. Don't cross Battaglia because he don't just kill you. He makes you wish you'd never been born. That's power." His companion, newer to the organization and visibly uncomfortable, asked the question Vivian wanted to scream. "But why? I mean, dead is dead. What's the point of making them suffer?" Vincent looked at him with something approaching pity. "Because Sal likes it. That's the only reason that matters." Vivian excused herself and made it to the ladies' room before her stomach betrayed her. She vomited into the toilet, her body rejecting not the food she'd eaten, but the knowledge she could no longer deny. Battaglia wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't simply a violent man running a violent business. He was something worse, someone who derived pleasure from others' pain, who'd structured his entire operation to maximize opportunities for cruelty. And she was sleeping with him. The physical relationship was something Vivian had anticipated but never grown comfortable with. Battaglia was methodical in bed, focused on his own satisfaction with the same cold efficiency he brought to his business dealings. He wasn't abusive. He never hit her, never forced her into anything that left visible marks. But there was a possessiveness to his touch that made her skin crawl, a sense that she was being inventoried rather than desired. Afterward, he would sometimes talk, treating her like a confessional that would never judge or repeat what it heard. It was during one of these post-coital monologues in early November that Battaglia revealed something that transformed Vivian's horror into rage. They were in the Astor Street apartment, Battaglia lying on his back staring at the ceiling, while Vivian sat against the headboard, a sheet pulled up to her shoulders. He was talking about his childhood, which he rarely did, a meandering story about growing up poor, about watching his mother beg for credit at the corner store, about the humiliation of worn-out shoes and hand-me-down clothes. "I swore then," he said quietly, "that I'd never be powerless again, that I'd never have to ask anyone for anything, that people would fear me so much they'd give me what I wanted before I even had to ask." "And the basement," Vivian heard herself say, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Does that help you feel powerful?" Battaglia turned his head to look at her, and for a moment she thought she'd gone too far. But then he smiled, that cold reptilian smile that never reached his eyes. "You've heard it," he said, not a question. "Everyone's heard it." "The basement," Battaglia said, rolling onto his side to face her, "is a laboratory. That's what I call it. A laboratory for testing loyalty, for understanding what people will do when they're broken down to their essential components. You'd be surprised what you learn. Some men beg immediately. Others try to bargain. They offer money, information, anything they think might save them. A few, very few, stay defiant to the end. Those are the ones I respect. Not enough to spare them, but I respect them." "Marco Santini," Vivian said, the name escaping before she could stop it. "Was he defiant?" Battaglia's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating. "Marco was disappointing. He cried for his mother. Grown man, nearly 30 years old, and the last word out of his mouth was "Mama." He said it with contempt, as if this final display of humanity was somehow shameful. But he lasted 3 days, which is longer than most. "Carlo thinks I should use the basement less. Says it's risky, that disposal is complicated, but Carlo doesn't understand. The basement isn't about convenience, it's about maintaining standards." Vivian forced herself to keep her face neutral, to play the role of the understanding mistress who'd heard nothing that disturbed her. But inside, something fundamental shifted. She'd been documenting Battaglia's crimes for months, collecting evidence like a squirrel hoarding nuts for winter. But she'd had no plan beyond documentation, no vision of what she might do with all those carefully recorded atrocities. Now she knew she was going to destroy him, not by going to the police. They were bought and paid for, their loyalty as certain as the sunrise. Not by going to the newspapers. They'd either ignore her or end up mysteriously silenced before publication. She was going to destroy him from within, using the one thing he'd never suspect: the underestimated intelligence of the woman he'd dismissed as decoration. She didn't know how yet. The details were formless, intuitive, rather than logical. But lying in bed, next to a man who ran a torture chamber and felt nothing but professional satisfaction, Vivian made herself a promise carved from pure hatred. Before this was over, Salvatore Battaglia would learn that powerlessness he'd sworn to escape. He would beg, he would bargain, he would cry for his mother. And she would be the one conducting that particular symphony in his laboratory of horrors. The first body wouldn't go into the basement for another 2 months, but the foundation of Chicago's bloodiest mob purge was laid that November night, in a bedroom on Astor Street, while a monster confessed his sins to someone he'd fatally mistaken for harmless. The first snow fell on Chicago in early December, transforming the city's brutal edges into something almost beautiful. Vivian watched it from her apartment window, the flakes drifting past the streetlights like dying moths, and thought about invisibility. Snow covered everything equally: the elegant brownstones of the Gold Coast and the cramped tenements of the West Side, the footprints of the righteous and the bloodstains of the damned. Nothing lasted. Spring would come, the snow would melt, and the truth of things would be revealed again. She'd been Battaglia's mistress for 10 months, long enough to understand the mechanics of his organization, long enough to identify the fault lines in his empire, long enough to recognize that the man Chicago feared was actually profoundly fragile, his power built on a foundation of terror that required constant reinforcement because it had no other structural support. The insight came to her gradually, assembled from dozens of overheard conversations and observed interactions. Battaglia's capos didn't love him. His soldiers didn't respect him beyond the fear he'd carefully cultivated. His alliances with other families were transactional, built on mutual benefit rather than genuine loyalty. Remove the fear, prove that Battaglia could bleed, could be beaten, and the entire structure would collapse like a house built from cards. But how? She was one woman with no organization, no muscle, no weapons beyond the information she'd been collecting, and even that information was useless without a way to deploy it. The answer arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks before Christmas. Battaglia had summoned her to the penthouse for what he described as a business dinner with associates who appreciate quality. Vivian had learned this meant she should wear something expensive and revealing, play her role as arm candy, and disappear into the background while men discussed things she wasn't supposed to understand. The guests that night were 4 members of the Chicago Outfit's Leadership Council, the men who governed the city's organized crime like cabinet secretaries in a shadow government. Tommy the Hammer Rizzo, whom she knew from previous meetings. Angelo Angie Bones Moretti, an older man with liver-spotted hands and eyes like chips of coal. Dominic Little Dom Catalano, whose nickname was ironic given his 6'3" frame. And Vincent Vinny Ace Accardo, who ran the West Side gambling operations and was rumored to be Battaglia's biggest rival within the organization. The dinner conversation was carefully neutral at first: sports, politics, the weather. But as the wine flowed and the inhibitions lowered, the discussion turned to business, and specifically to the problem of Sam Giancana's expanding influence in the Chicago outfit. "He's making moves," Vinny Ace said, his voice carrying the slight slur of someone on their 4th glass of Chianti. "Bringing in his own people, cutting deals with the Northsiders without clearing it through proper channels. He's acting like he's already running things, and Occado's letting him get away with it. Occado's getting old, Battaglia said dismissively. He's lost his edge. Maybe it's time for new leadership. The table went quiet. Even through her practiced detachment, Vivian understood the significance of what she'd just heard. Tony Occado was the de facto boss of the Chicago outfit, a man so powerful that even mentioning his name in a negative context was dangerous. For Battaglia to openly question his leadership was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. "You thinking about making a move?" Little Dom asked carefully. "I'm thinking," Battaglia said, "that opportunities exist for men willing to see them. Giancana's ambitious but sloppy. He leaves trails, makes enemies. Someone smart could use that, could document his mistakes, his unauthorized operations, his disrespect for protocol, could present that documentation to Occado at exactly the right moment, could position themselves as the solution to a problem they helped create." And there it was, a complete blueprint for a political coup within the Chicago outfit, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. The dinner continued for another 2 hours, the conversation shifting to safer topics, but Vivian's mind was racing, pieces falling into place with the satisfying click of a lock tumbling open. Battaglia had just revealed the fundamental mechanism of power in his world, information leveraged at the right moment against the right target. You didn't need an army if you could convince someone else's army to turn on their leader. After the guests left and Battaglia had fallen asleep in the penthouse bedroom, Vivian lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking, if Battaglia could use information as a weapon, so could she. If he could identify rivals and exploit their weaknesses, she could do the same. The difference was that she had an advantage he'd never considered. She was invisible. No one watched what she saw, because no one believed she was capable of understanding what she saw. The plan began to form in her mind, rough and incomplete but real. She would do what Battaglia did, document everything, identify weaknesses, wait for the perfect moment, but her target wasn't a rival boss. It was Battaglia himself. And the weapon she'd use wasn't information presented to allies, but information presented to enemies. Over the next weeks, Vivian's activities took on new purpose. She began engaging with the people Battaglia dismissed as irrelevant, the bartenders, the drivers, the cleaning women who scrubbed the blood from the basement floor of the Kedzie Avenue Social Club. She learned their names, asked about their families, slipped them small gifts, a bottle of wine at Christmas, a few extra dollars when they seemed stressed about bills. She became someone they felt comfortable talking to, someone they trusted with small confidences that gradually grew larger. From Enzo the bartender, she learned that 3 of Battaglia's soldiers were quietly unhappy with their boss's increasingly erratic behavior, his tendency to punish minor mistakes with excessive violence. From Frank the driver, she learned that Battaglia had been meeting secretly with representatives from the Cicero crew, meetings that weren't being reported to the outfit leadership. From Maria the cleaning woman, she learned about the basement's frequency of use, and about the false panel in the wall where Carlo kept files that were never supposed to leave the building. She filed away every piece of information, cross-referencing it with what she already knew, building a 3-dimensional map of Battaglia's operation in her mind. She started using a more sophisticated code in her journal, one based on the Latin hymns she'd memorized as a girl in Catholic school. To anyone who stumbled across it, the entries would look like religious devotions, but Vivian could decode them instantly, transforming prayers into indictments. By February 1951, she had documented 17 instances of extreme torture in the Kedzie Avenue basement, 12 unauthorized business arrangements, 8 violations of outfit protocol, and 4 separate plots Battaglia was developing to undermine other members of the Chicago organization. She had names, dates, witnesses, and enough corroborating detail to make the information credible. What she didn't have was a delivery mechanism. She couldn't simply mail her journal to Tony Occado and hope for the best. She needed an intermediary, someone with credibility and access, someone who could present the information in a way that would trigger action rather than suspicion. The answer, when it came, was so obvious, she almost laughed. She needed a cop. Not just any cop. Chicago's police department was thoroughly corrupted, with most officers either on someone's payroll or too intimidated to act against organized crime. But there were exceptions. Rumors circulated about a new detective in the state's attorney office, someone transferred in from New York specifically to investigate organized crime connections. Someone who'd built his reputation on being incorruptible, which in Chicago was either admirable or suicidal. His name was Michael O'Brien, and by all accounts he was both. The trick would be approaching him without exposing herself, without leaving a trail that would lead back to her if the plan failed. She would need to be careful, patient. She would need to wait for exactly the right moment. That moment arrived in late February, during a conversation she witnessed at the social club between Battaglia and Carlo about the O'Brien problem. "He's asking questions," Carlo said, his voice tight with concern. "Interviewing people in the neighborhood, showing photographs. One of them was Marco Santini." Battaglia waved dismissively. "Let him ask. No one's going to talk. They know better. What if someone does? What if... Then we handle it." Battaglia's tone carried the finality of someone who'd made this calculation 1,000 times. "O'Brien bleeds same as anyone else. He's not the first righteous cop we've dealt with. Won't be the last." Vivian absorbed this, her pulse quickening. O'Brien was already investigating, he was already circling. He just needed direction, a push toward evidence he couldn't ignore, presented in a way that protected the source. She would give him that push, but first, she needed insurance. Because once she set this machine in motion, there would be no stopping it. Battaglia would learn he'd been betrayed, and his response would be volcanic. She needed to make sure that when the bodies started dropping, hers wouldn't be among them. The winter wind howled outside the social club, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows. Inside, men drank and played cards and pretended they were civilized. And upstairs, a woman they'd dismissed as decoration plotted the destruction of everything they'd built. Spring was coming. The snow would melt, and the truth of things would finally be revealed. Detective Michael O'Brien lived in a gray stone apartment building on the near north side, 3 blocks from the state's attorney's office, where he'd worked for exactly 4 months and 13 days. Vivian knew this because she'd been watching him for 3 weeks, learning his routines with the same patient attention to detail that Battaglia's men used when planning a hit. O'Brien was exactly what the rumors suggested, incorruptible to the point of foolishness. He was 38, a transplant from NYPD's organized crime unit brought to Chicago by state's attorney John Boyle in a much publicized effort to crack down on the city's mob operations. He was tall and thin, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of angular face that suggested either great intensity or chronic indigestion. He walked to work every morning at 7:15, ate lunch at his desk, and worked until 8 or 9 at night. He had no wife, no girlfriend, and apparently no life beyond the job. He was perfect. The letter took Vivian 4 days to compose, written in printed block letters to disguise her handwriting, and mailed from a post office in Oak Park, far from her usual routes. She made it comprehensive but not overwhelming, enough specific detail to be credible, but not so much that it seemed fabricated. She included dates, locations, names. She described the basement at the Kedzie Avenue Social Club, the false panel in the wall, the files that Carlo kept. She mentioned the 17 victims she'd documented, though she was careful not to reveal how she knew the exact number. She positioned herself as a concerned citizen who'd stumbled across information too dangerous to ignore. The letter concluded with a single paragraph. "Detective O'Brien, you've built your reputation on integrity. You're investigating Marco Santini's disappearance. You won't find his body. It was dissolved in acid and poured into Lake Michigan, but you'll find evidence of his murder and 16 others in the basement of the social club on Kedzie Avenue. The man responsible is protected by money and fear, but fear can be broken if someone is brave enough to look in the right places. Are you that someone?" She mailed it on a Tuesday morning in early March and then waited, monitoring the newspapers for any indication that O'Brien had acted on the information. Days passed with no news, then a week. Vivian began to worry that the letter had been dismissed as a crank note, one of dozens that probably arrived in O'Brien's office every week. Then, on a Friday evening at the social club, Carlo burst into the back room where Battaglia was meeting with Tommy Rizzo, his face flushed with alarm. "We've got a problem," Carlo said, breathless. "The state's attorney's office. They've got a warrant." Battaglia's expression didn't change. "A warrant for what?" "The building. They're executing a search warrant right now. There's 6 cars outside." For the first time since Vivian had known him, Sal Battaglia looked genuinely frightened. It lasted only a moment, a flicker of fear quickly suppressed, but she saw it. And in that moment she felt something close to joy. The raid was methodical and thorough. O'Brien himself led the team, moving through the social club with the focused determination of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. They tore apart the back office, photographed everything, seized boxes of files. But the real discovery came when they found the basement entrance, hidden behind a false wall in the storage room, and descended into what the newspapers would later describe as a chamber of horrors. Vivian wasn't present for the basement search. Battaglia had ordered everyone out immediately when the police arrived, and she'd left with the other civilians, walking past the line of police cars with her head down and her heart racing. But she heard about it later from Enzo, who heard it from his nephew who worked as a janitor in the state's attorney's building. They'd found bloodstains on the concrete floor despite multiple attempts to scrub them clean. They'd found tools, pliers, knives, a car battery with jumper cables attached. They'd found the false panel in the wall and the files inside. Carlo's meticulous records of sessions, complete with dates, durations, and clinical notes about effectiveness. The files didn't contain names. Carlo wasn't that sloppy, but they contained enough circumstantial detail to corroborate what Vivian had written in her letter. More importantly, they found hair and tissue samples that could be subjected to the new forensic techniques that were revolutionizing criminal investigations. The science was still primitive. This was 1951. But it was enough to place specific individuals in that basement, enough to connect them to the missing persons reports that had accumulated over the past 2 years. The newspapers exploded. "Mob torture chamber discovered," screamed the Tribune. "Basement of horrors, state's attorney raids crime den," declared the Sun-Times. Suddenly, Chicago's comfortable arrangement with organized crime, the unspoken understanding that the mob operated with relative impunity, was front-page news, complete with photographs of the Kedzie Avenue Social Club and artists' renderings of what the basement might have looked like during its operations. Battaglia wasn't arrested immediately. The evidence was circumstantial, and his lawyers, an army of expensive suits who descended on the state's attorney's office like a plague, argued that their client had no knowledge of what happened in a basement he never visited, in a building he merely owned through a series of shell corporations. It was Carlo who was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and torture. But everyone knew the real target was Battaglia, and everyone knew that Carlo, facing life in prison or worse, might decide to talk. The question was whether he'd live long enough to make it to trial. Vivian watched all of this unfold with a strange mixture of satisfaction and terror. She'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped, but she had no control over where it would go. Battaglia was wounded but not defeated. The investigation was progressing but slowly. And most dangerous of all, Battaglia was now paranoid and violent, convinced that he'd been betrayed from within, and determined to identify the traitor. He came to her apartment 2 nights after the raid, arriving without warning, his eyes wild and his movements erratic. Vivian had been preparing for bed, wearing a nightgown, her hair loose. She opened the door to find him standing there, and her first thought was that this was it. He'd somehow figured out her role, and she was about to become body 18 in his collection. "Did you know?" he demanded, pushing past her into the apartment. "Know what?" "About the raid, about O'Brien. Did you fucking know?" Vivian forced herself to look confused and frightened, not difficult, given that both emotions were genuine. "Sal, I don't understand. What happened?" He grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Someone talked. Someone gave O'Brien information that only an insider would know. Details about the basement, about the files, about operations. "I need to know if it was you." "How could it be me?" Vivian said, letting tears fill her eyes. "I don't know anything about your business. You've always made sure I didn't. Remember? Deaf, dumb, and blind. That's what you said. I'm just decoration, Sal. So I'm nobody." He stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for deception. Vivian held his gaze, her eyes wide and wet, her expression helpless. She was gambling everything on the assumption that worked in her favor from the beginning, that Battaglia, couldn't conceive of her as a threat because he'd spent 10 months reinforcing his own belief that she was intellectually and strategically harmless. Finally, he released her, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said, though he didn't sound sorry. "I'm not myself. This thing with Carlo, with the investigation, it's making me crazy." "Of course it is," Vivian said, rubbing her shoulders where he'd grabbed her. "But you didn't do anything wrong. The police will realize that. Everything will be fine." Battaglia laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Nothing's going to be fine. Even if I beat the charges, the damage is done. The other families are circling. They see weakness, and weakness is blood in the water." He moved to her small bar cart and poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, drinking it in 2 swallows. "I'm going to find out who did this. And when I do—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He left shortly after, and Vivian locked the door behind him, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to engage the deadbolt. She'd passed the test, but barely. And she knew that Battaglia's investigation into the leak would be exhaustive and brutal. Anyone he even suspected would disappear into that basement, assuming the basement was even operational given the police surveillance. She needed to accelerate her timeline. Carlo's trial was scheduled for June. That gave her 3 months to ensure that when Carlo took the stand, he didn't just implicate Battaglia in the basement murders. He implicated him in everything. The entire rotting structure of the Battaglia organization laid bare for the state's attorney, the newspapers, and most importantly, the other mob families who were watching to see how this played out. To do that, she needed to get to Carlo, and she needed to do it before Battaglia got to him first. The plan that formed in her mind was insane. It relied on assumptions she couldn't verify, on people behaving in ways she could only hope for, on luck and timing, and a dozen variables beyond her control. But she was past the point of caution. She'd lit the fuse. Now she needed to make sure the explosion was big enough to destroy everything in its blast radius, including, if necessary, herself. Carlo Benedetti was being held at the Cook County Jail pending trial, housed in a special unit for prisoners whose presence in general population would either get them killed or result in everyone else getting killed. Vivian understood this was less about protecting Carlo than protecting the investment the state's attorney had made in keeping him alive long enough to testify. Getting a visit approved was the first challenge. Vivian had no official relationship to Carlo. She was neither family nor legal counsel, and the jail wasn't in the habit of allowing casual visits to high-profile mob prisoners. But she had advantages. She was a woman, which made her seem less threatening. She was beautiful, which made men want to do her favors, and she knew exactly how to play the role of someone harmless and slightly stupid. She started with the administrative office, arriving on a Tuesday morning when she knew the assistant warden would be on duty, a man named Walter Henriksen who'd been pointed out to her at a restaurant months ago by Battaglia as someone on the payroll. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her makeup minimal. She looked like a secretary or a librarian, someone respectable and forgettable. "I need to speak with Mr. Henriksen," she told the receptionist, a middle-aged woman whose expression suggested she'd heard every story and believed none of them. "Regarding? It's a personal matter. Family business." The receptionist's eyebrows rose skeptically, but she made the call. 10 minutes later, Vivian was sitting across from Henriksen in his cluttered office, surrounded by filing cabinets and wanted posters. Henriksen was in his 50s, overweight, with thinning hair and the permanently tired expression of someone who'd spent too long in a job that ground people down. He looked at Vivian with the weary suspicion of a man who dealt with lies professionally. "How can I help you, Miss Rossi?" Vivian Rossi. She debated using a fake name but decided against it. The risk of being caught in that lie was too high. "I need to visit one of your prisoners." "Carlo Benedetti." Henriksen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Your family?" "No, She paused, as if embarrassed. "I was involved with his employer, Mr. Battaglia. Carlo was always kind to me, respectful. And now he's here, and I heard he's not allowed regular visitors, and I thought—" She let her voice trail off, wringing her hands in her lap. "I know it's unusual, but I feel terrible about what happened. I want him to know someone cares." It was a good performance, vulnerable but not overly dramatic, sympathetic but not suspicious. Henriksen studied her for a long moment, clearly calculating. "Miss Rossi, You understand that Mr. Benedetti is facing serious charges, multiple counts of murder. The state's attorney's office has very strict protocols about who can visit. I understand. I just thought. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the desk. Maybe there's some administrative fee for processing the request? Henriksen looked at the envelope, thick enough to suggest significant cash, and then back at Vivian. How much? $500 for your trouble. It was exactly the right amount, enough to be meaningful, but not so much as to seem like a bribe for something illegal. Henriksen picked up the envelope, thumbed through the bills inside, and nodded slowly. I can arrange a 15-minute visit. Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock. You'll be searched before you go in. No physical contact with the prisoner. A guard will be present at all times. Those are the rules. Thank you, Vivian said, letting relief flood her face. Thank you so much. Thursday afternoon arrived cold and grey, the kind of March day that reminded Chicagoans winter wasn't quite finished with them. Vivian dressed conservatively, a dark skirt, a cream blouse buttoned to her throat, low heels. She submitted to the search with calm professionalism, allowing the female guard to pat her down, check her purse, and verify she wasn't carrying anything that could be used as a weapon or passed to a prisoner. The visiting room was small and institutional, with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs positioned across from each other. A guard stood by the door, arms crossed, expression bored. Vivian sat and waited, her hands folded on the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. Carlo entered 5 minutes later, escorted by 2 guards. He looked terrible, thinner with dark circles under his eyes and a grayish pallor that suggested neither sleep nor sunlight. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and he moved with the careful shuffle of someone who'd learned that sudden movements resulted in pain. When he saw Vivian, his expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of weary resignation. He sat across from her, and the guard stepped back to give them the illusion of privacy, though Vivian knew every word would be monitored. Miss Rossi, Carlo said, his voice hoarse. I didn't expect you. I wanted to see how you were, Vivian said, keeping her tone gentle, concerned. This must be terrible for you. Carlo laughed, a short, bitter sound. Terrible doesn't begin to cover it. They made small talk for a minute, dancing around the real reason for the visit. Vivian asked about the conditions, the food, whether he needed anything. Carlo answered in monosyllables, his eyes never quite meeting hers, clearly wondering what she really wanted. Finally, Vivian leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Carlo, I need to tell you something. It's important. He tensed. What? Sal's planning to kill you. The words hung in the air between them. The guard by the door shifted slightly but didn't intervene. This wasn't a threat, just information. Carlo's face went blank, as if he'd heard something he'd been expecting but hoping to avoid. How do you know? Because I was there when he discussed it. 2 nights ago at the apartment. He was talking with Tommy Rizzo. He said the trial's too risky, that you know too much. He said the guards can be bribed, that you could have an accident in the shower or choke on your food. He said it would be handled before June. It was a lie. Battaglia had said nothing of the sort, but it was a plausible lie. Exactly the kind of thing Battaglia would say, and Carlo's reaction suggested he believed it completely. Jesus, Carlo whispered, his face going even grayer. Jesus Christ. You can stop him, Vivian said urgently. Talk to the state's attorney, tell them everything, dates, names, operations. Give them enough to bury Sal and they'll protect you. They'll put you in witness protection, relocate you, give you a new life. If I do that, I'm dead anyway. Maybe not from Sal, but from someone else. The families don't forgive traitors. You're dead if you don't, Vivian said bluntly. At least this way, you get to choose how you go. You get to take him down with you. Don't you want that, after everything he's done? After what he made you do in that basement? Carlo's eyes finally met hers, and in them Vivian saw something she'd been hoping for. Rage. Not at her, but at Battaglia. The accumulated resentment of years spent as someone's attack dog, of carrying out orders that turned his stomach, of becoming a monster because his boss demanded it. Why are you doing this? Carlo asked quietly. What's in it for you? Nothing, Vivian said. And for once she was telling the complete truth. I just want him to pay for what he's done. And I can't do it alone. Carlo stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for deception. Then he nodded slowly, as if making a decision that would define whatever remained of his life. "Tell the prosecutor I'll talk," he said, "but I want full immunity, and I want out of Cook County. This jail's not safe. Henrikson's on Sal's payroll. Everyone knows it." "I'll tell them," Vivian promised. "They'll protect you, Carlo, I promise." It was a promise she had no authority to make, but Carlo seemed to take comfort from it anyway. The visit ended shortly after, and Vivian left the jail feeling both exhilarated and terrified. She just turned Battaglia's most trusted lieutenant into a state's witness. The betrayal would be devastating when it went public, but first, she had to make sure Carlo lived long enough to testify. And that meant moving faster than she'd planned, pushing events toward their inevitable collision before Battaglia could counter. She made 2 phone calls that evening from a payphone far from her apartment. The first was to the state's attorney's office, leaving a message for Detective O'Brien that Carlo Benedetti wanted to make a deal. The second was to the Tribune's crime reporter, anonymously tipping him off that Battaglia's chief lieutenant was about to turn state's evidence. By morning, the story would be everywhere, and once it was public, Battaglia couldn't kill Carlo without making himself the obvious suspect. The investigation would intensify. The pressure would mount. The other families would start distancing themselves from someone who'd become a liability. The dominoes were falling. All Vivian had to do now was survive long enough to watch them hit the ground. But survival, she was learning, was never guaranteed in a world where men solved problems with basements and bodies and acid that dissolved evidence along with human remains. The news hit like an earthquake. Battaglia lieutenant to testify for state. The Tribune ran it front page, complete with photographs of Carlo and courthouse diagrams. By noon, every newspaper in Chicago had picked up the story, and by evening, the radio broadcasts were discussing little else. Carlo Benedetti, the man believed responsible for at least 17 murders, had agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges and protective custody. The Chicago underworld convulsed. Vivian heard about it through Enzo, who called her apartment at 6 in the morning, his voice shaking. "Miss Rossi, don't go near the club today. Don't go near anywhere Sal might be. It's..." He paused, searching for words. "It's bad, really bad." She thanked him and hung up, then spent the rest of the day monitoring the radio and newspapers, piecing together what was happening through news reports and the coded messages she intercepted by calling contacts in the neighborhood. Battaglia had gone into hiding. Not literally, he was too proud for that, but he'd retreated to his Oak Park mansion and wasn't taking calls or meetings. Tommy Rizzo and the other capos were scrambling to contain the damage, but the fractures were already showing. Other families were distancing themselves, canceling joint operations, pulling back their soldiers from shared territories. The outfit leadership, particularly Tony Accardo, was rumored to be furious. Carlo's cooperation meant federal attention, grand juries, a cascade of investigations that would expose operations across the entire Chicago organization. And it was all traced back to one man's basement and his inability to maintain proper operational security. By the following week, whispers began that Battaglia had been summoned to a meeting with the outfit's ruling council. No one knew exactly what was discussed, but the message was clear. Fix this problem or be treated as the problem itself. Vivian monitored all of this from her apartment, barely leaving except for necessities. She'd stopped answering Battaglia's calls, first because she was genuinely frightened, and second because she wanted him isolated, cut off from the people he'd relied on. She paid Enzo to keep her informed about activity at the social club, Frank to report on Battaglia's movements, Maria to watch the Oak Park house and note who visited. She was building a real-time intelligence network, and what it showed terrified her. Battaglia was preparing for war. The first casualty was Anthony Greco, the bookkeeper who managed the organization's financial records. He disappeared on a Tuesday evening, last seen leaving his apartment in Cicero. His body was found 3 days later in an alley on the west side, beaten so severely that dental records were required for identification. The message was clear: talk to the prosecutors and suffer the consequences. The second casualty was Detective O'Brien's partner, a younger investigator named Thomas Walsh who'd been helping with the Battaglia investigation. Walsh was shot outside his apartment building in what police described as an apparent robbery, though his wallet and watch remained on his body. The newspapers reported it as a tragic coincidence. Everyone else knew better. Vivian realized with growing horror that she'd underestimated Battaglia's capacity for violence when cornered. She'd assumed that public exposure would neuter him, that the threat of prosecution would force him to be cautious. Instead, it had transformed him into something more dangerous, a wounded animal with nothing left to lose. She needed to move faster. Carlo's testimony was scheduled for early May, just 6 weeks away. Before then, she needed to ensure that Battaglia's organization was so thoroughly compromised that even if he escaped prosecution, he'd never recover his position in the Chicago underworld. The opportunity came from an unexpected source: Battaglia's wife. Vivian had never met Constance Battaglia. The woman was a ghost in her husband's city life, mentioned occasionally but never present. She lived in Oak Park with her 2 teenage sons, attending Mass at St. Edmund's Catholic Church, running charity fundraisers, maintaining the respectable facade that allowed her husband's criminal empire to operate in shadow. But respectability, Vivian was learning, had limits. Constance Battaglia appeared at Vivian's apartment on a Thursday afternoon in mid-April, arriving without warning, accompanied by a driver who waited in the car downstairs. She was 53, impeccably dressed in a navy suit and pearl earrings, with grey-streaked dark hair pulled into a chignon. Her face bore the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the ability to reveal nothing. When Vivian opened the door, Constance studied her with the clinical assessment of someone examining a disease specimen. "Miss Rossi, may I come in?" Vivian stepped aside, pulse accelerating. This was either a confrontation or a trap, possibly both. Constance entered the apartment, her gaze sweeping across the furniture, the minimal decoration, the obvious impermanence of the space. She sat on the sofa without invitation, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. "I'll be direct," Constance said. "My husband is destroying himself. This investigation, this trial, the violence, it's going to end with him in prison or dead. Probably both." "I'm sorry," Vivian said carefully, remaining standing. "I don't know what you want me to—" "Don't insult me," Constance interrupted, her voice sharp. "I know what you are. I've known about you since the beginning. I've known about all of them. The secretaries, the showgirls, the women Salvatore keeps in apartments and pretends are invisible. I've made peace with that arrangement because it gave me what I wanted. Security, respectability, a home for my sons, away from his ugliness." She paused, her carefully controlled facade cracking slightly. "But this situation is different. Carlo's testimony will destroy everything. Not just Salvatore's operations, but my life, my son's futures. The FBI is already asking questions about assets. They'll seize the house, the bank accounts, everything. My boys will grow up as the sons of a mob boss who died in prison. That's not acceptable. What do you want from me?" Constance met her eyes directly. "I want you to convince Salvatore to run. Leave the country. Go to Italy, Mexico, anywhere. Start over. Let Carlo testify. Let the organization collapse. Let it all burn. Just save himself and save us by extension." Vivian stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of the request. "You think he'd listen to me? I'm just his mistress." "Yes, but you have influence you don't recognize. Salvatore talks about you. Not to me. We haven't had a real conversation in years, but to our sons. He mentions you at family dinners, describes you as clever, observant, different from the others. He respects you in ways he didn't respect your predecessors." Constance's mouth twisted into something not quite a smile. "Use that respect. Convince him to leave before it's too late. And if I can't, then we'll all suffer the consequences together." Constance stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'm not a fool, Miss Rossi. I know you're not simply a kept woman. I see the intelligence in your eyes, the calculation. Whatever you're planning, whatever role you've played in Salvatore's current predicament, I don't care. I just want to protect my children. If that means sacrificing my husband, so be it. But I'd prefer he do the sacrificing himself." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. If you can convince him to leave, I'll ensure you're compensated. $100,000 transferred through Swiss accounts. Enough to start your own life somewhere far from Chicago. Think about it." She left before Vivian could respond, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the implication of choices that all ended badly. That evening, Battaglia called. First time in 2 weeks. I need to see you, he said without preamble. Tomorrow night. The Astor Street apartment. 9 o'clock. Sal, I don't think... It's not a request. His voice carried the edge of someone barely maintaining control. Be there. He hung up before she could argue. Vivian stood in her kitchen, phone in hand, and understood that tomorrow night would decide everything. Either she would convince Battaglia to run, saving herself while letting him escape justice, or she would go through with her original plan, pushing him toward the catastrophic confrontation that would destroy him completely. Constance's offer was tempting. $100,000 and freedom, a chance to walk away before the violence escalated, a chance to survive. But survival had never been the only point. Justice was, revenge was, making sure that every man who'd underestimated her, dismissed her, used her, learned that women remember everything. She spent that night writing letters, detailed accounts of everything she'd witnessed, every crime she'd documented, every piece of evidence she'd collected. She addressed them to Detective O'Brien, to the Tribune's editor, to the federal prosecutor's office. She sealed them and gave them to 3 different people she trusted, Enzo, Maria, and Frank, with instructions to mail them if anything happened to her. Then she prepared for the meeting that would either liberate her or kill her. Either way, Sal Battaglia's empire would burn. She'd make sure of that. The Astor Street apartment felt different when Vivian arrived Friday night at 9 o'clock. Smaller somehow, as if the walls had contracted during her absence. Or perhaps she'd simply grown too large for the space, evolved beyond the scared woman who'd first walked through these doors thinking herself lucky to be chosen. Battaglia was waiting in the living room, sitting in the dark, only the city lights through the windows providing illumination. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence for a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if he'd been drinking or crying or both. Do you know what it's like to build something from nothing? To take the scraps the world gives you and forge them into power? Vivian closed the door behind her, but remained standing, maintaining distance between them. No, I was 10 years old when my father died. Worked himself to death in a factory, breaking his body for pennies while the owner lived in a mansion on Lake Shore Drive. At his funeral, I swore I'd never be like him. Never let someone else's boot rest on my neck. He turned to look at her, his face gaunt in the shadows. Everything I built, every move I made, was about never being powerless again, about being the one who decides who lives and who dies. And now? Vivian asked quietly. And now I'm being destroyed by people I should have destroyed first. Carlo, who I treated like a son, those cops who were supposed to stay bought, that reporter who won't stop writing stories, and... He paused, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. And whoever gave them the information that started all of this. The temperature in the room dropped. Vivian forced herself to remain still, to betray nothing. I've been thinking about that, Battaglia continued, standing now, moving slowly toward her. About who knew enough to give O'Brien those details. It wasn't Carlo. He was already arrested when the tip came in. Wasn't any of my capos. They'd have to implicate themselves. So who? Who was invisible enough to see everything but smart enough to know what mattered? He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. You, he said simply. Vivian's mind raced through possible responses, denial, confusion, tears. But looking into Battaglia's eyes, she saw something that made all those performances pointless. He knew. Whether through genuine deduction or paranoid certainty, he'd arrived at the truth. Lying now would just insult them both. Yes, she said. She expected violence, expected him to hit her, strangle her, pull out the gun she knew he carried in an ankle holster. Instead, Battaglia laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and something close to admiration. You, he repeated, shaking his head. The quiet little mouse I kept around for decoration. Jesus Christ, Vivian, you're smarter than all my capos combined. I learned from you, she said, holding his gaze. You taught me how to watch, how to listen, how to use information as a weapon. I was just a better student than you expected. Why? What did I do that was so terrible you'd risk your life to destroy me? The question was almost funny in its obliviousness. Vivian felt 16 months of suppressed rage bubble up, threatening to explode into words that would probably get her killed, but she could no longer contain. You ran a torture chamber in a basement and spoke about it like it was a hobby, You made a game of causing maximum suffering because it made you feel powerful. You created an empire built on terror and acted like that made you respectable, and you surrounded yourself with people like me, like Carlo, like all your soldiers, and never once considered that we might have our own thoughts, our own capacity for revenge. So this is about morality. Battaglia's voice carried a mocking edge. You're some kind of righteous crusader. No. I'm someone you underestimated, and that's going to cost you everything. The silence that followed was electric with potential violence. Vivian knew she should be terrified. She was alone with a man who'd killed dozens, who had nothing left to lose, who now knew she was responsible for his downfall. But what she felt instead was a strange liberation. No more pretending, no more performances, just two people facing each other with complete honesty about what they were. I should kill you, Battaglia said finally. You should, but you won't. Why not? Because if I disappear, those letters I wrote, the ones documenting everything I witnessed, will be mailed to the state's attorney, the FBI, and every newspaper in Chicago. I gave them to people you can't reach, people you don't even know exist. Kill me and you ensure your conviction. Let me live and you have a chance. A chance at what? Leaving. Your wife came to see me. She wants you to run. Italy, Mexico, somewhere without extradition. Take what money you can move, start over. Let this all collapse behind you. It's not the ending you wanted, but it's better than dying in prison or being killed by the outfit for bringing too much heat. Battaglia stared at her, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. And you? What do you get out of this? I get to watch you lose, Vivian said simply. I get to know that you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, powerless and afraid, experiencing exactly what you spent 30 years trying to escape. That's enough. He turned away, moving to the window, looking out at the city he'd tried to own. When he spoke again, his voice was tired, the voice of someone who'd accepted defeat. I'm not running. I won't give them the satisfaction of knowing they broke me. I'll face this trial. I'll beat it or I won't. But I'll do it on my feet, not crawling away like a dog. Then you'll die, Vivian said. Maybe in prison, maybe when the outfit decides you're too much liability. But you'll die. Everyone dies, Battaglia said. The question is whether you die as yourself or as something lesser. He turned back to her, and in the dim light he looked older than his 46 years, worn down by the weight of maintaining an empire built on quicksand. You can go. I won't stop you. I won't hurt you. Consider it professional respect, one predator to another. Vivian moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Sal, you were right about one thing. The world is brutal to people without power. But you made a mistake about what power means. You thought it was fear. But fear without loyalty is just a timer counting down to betrayal. Real power is being underestimated. Real power is remembering. She left before he could respond, walking out of the Astor Street apartment for the last time, leaving behind a man who'd finally understood that the woman he'd dismissed as decoration had become his executioner. The next morning, Vivian disappeared. Not literally. She didn't leave Chicago, didn't assume a new identity, but she retreated from the world where Sal Battaglia operated, moving to a different apartment in Hyde Park, under her real name, taking a job at a bookstore, becoming invisible again through ordinariness rather than pretended stupidity. And she waited for the trial, for the moment when Carlo would take the stand and confirm everything she'd told O'Brien, when the Chicago newspapers would detail every horror of the Kedzie Avenue basement, when Sal Battaglia would face the consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. She'd survived. But survival was just the first act. The reckoning was still to come. The trial of Salvatore Battaglia began on May 14, 1951, in a Chicago courtroom packed with reporters, curiosity seekers, and representatives from every major crime family in the Midwest. The judge was Harold Morrison, a 70-year-old jurist known for his rigid interpretation of law and his immunity to bribery, a rare combination in Cook County. The prosecution was led by Assistant State's Attorney Robert Kensington, a methodical Harvard graduate who'd built his reputation on organized crime cases in Boston before transferring to Chicago. Battaglia's defense consisted of 3 high-priced attorneys led by Marcus Bloom, a legendary criminal lawyer who'd never lost a capital murder case in 27 years of practice. Vivian attended every day, sitting in the back row gallery, her appearance transformed by different wigs, glasses, conservative clothing that made her look like a school teacher or secretary. She needed to witness this, needed to see the monster exposed in the daylight of public examination. The first week was procedural: jury selection, opening arguments, establishing the timeline. Kensington painted a picture of systematic brutality. 17 victims, 17 families destroyed, 17 instances where Battaglia ordered murders to protect his criminal empire. The bodies were gone, dissolved in acid or dumped in the lake, but the evidence remained. DNA samples from the basement, testimonies from neighbors who heard screams, the forensic analysis of tools found in hidden compartments. Bloom's defense was predictable but effective. Battaglia was a legitimate businessman who owned the building but had no knowledge of what happened in spaces he never visited. Carlo Benedetti, the actual murderer, had operated independently, using his employer's property for personal criminal activities. The prosecution's case was circumstantial, built on conjecture rather than proof. By the end of week 2, the jury looked uncertain. The evidence was damning, but indirect. Vivian could see the calculation in their faces. Conviction meant confronting the reality that such horror existed in their city. Acquittal meant pretending it didn't. Then Carlo took the stand. He'd lost 30 pounds since his arrest. His suit hung loose on his frame and his hands trembled even when folded in his lap. But his voice, when he began testifying, was steady and terrifyingly specific. "Mr. Battaglia ordered me to establish what he called a laboratory in the basement of the social club," Carlo testified, his eyes fixed on some point above the jury's heads, unable to look at their faces while describing what he'd done. The purpose was twofold: extract information from individuals suspected of disloyalty and send a message to anyone considering betrayal about what would happen to them. Over 4 days of testimony, Carlo detailed the mechanics of the basement's operation: how victims were brought in through the back entrance, usually late at night, how they were restrained to a chair bolted to the concrete floor, how Battaglia had specific instructions about which methods to use depending on the offense: pliers for fingers if they'd stolen money, the car battery if they'd talked to police, the knives for those who disrespected him personally. The courtroom was silent except for Carlo's voice and the occasional sob from family members of the victims. The jury looked sick. Even Judge Morrison, who'd presided over dozens of murder trials, seemed shaken. "Did Mr. Battaglia ever witness these sessions?" Kensington asked. "Yes, not every time, but frequently. He'd come down to check progress, to ask questions, to make suggestions. He was—" Carlo paused, searching for words. "He was interested in the process, scientific about it. He took notes." "Notes about what?" "About effectiveness, which methods produced information fastest, which caused the most fear. He kept a journal hidden in the false panel in his penthouse study. He called it his laboratory results. This was new information, not mentioned in any previous testimony." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison gavelled for silence while Bloom leaped to his feet, objecting strenuously. The journal had never been produced as evidence, he argued, because it didn't exist. Carlo was fabricating details to secure his reduced sentence, but Kensington was prepared. "Your Honor, based on Mr. Benedetti's testimony, we obtained a search warrant for Mr. Battaglia's penthouse apartment yesterday evening. Detective O'Brien, would you approach the bench?" O'Brien came forward carrying an evidence bag containing a leather-bound journal, its cover worn with handling. The prosecution had found it exactly where Carlo said it would be, and its contents, read aloud in clinical, horrifying detail over the next 3 hours, removed any possibility of reasonable doubt. Battaglia had documented everything: names, dates, methods, results. He'd written about the pleasure of control, the satisfaction of breaking men who'd thought themselves strong. He described victims' final moments with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing specimens, and he'd explicitly identified which murders were business necessity versus which were personal entertainment. By the time Kensington finished presenting excerpts, 2 jurors were crying. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Even Bloom seemed uncertain how to proceed. Battaglia himself showed no emotion, sitting at the defense table with perfect stillness, his face a carved mask. Only his eyes moved, tracking the proceedings with the calculating assessment of someone already planning his next move. The defense's cross-examination of Carlo was brutal, but ineffective. Bloom tried to establish that Carlo was the actual mastermind, that he'd manipulated Battaglia into signing off on actions he didn't understand. But the journal undermined every argument. Battaglia's own words condemned him. The final witness for the prosecution was Detective O'Brien, who testified about receiving the anonymous letter that sparked the investigation. He read portions of it aloud, describing how specific details in the letter matched evidence later found in the basement. "Do you have any knowledge of who sent this letter?" Bloom asked during cross-examination. "No. The letter was typed mailed from Oak Park and contained no identifying information. So we're supposed to believe some mystery person with detailed inside knowledge of my client's operations decided to turn him in anonymously. Doesn't that seem convenient? Doesn't it suggest that perhaps your office fabricated this evidence to justify an illegal search?" O'Brien's expression hardened. "The letter came from someone with access to information that only an insider would know. Someone who witnessed these crimes and decided they couldn't stay silent. I don't know who they are, but I thank God they found the courage to come forward." Vivian sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap, and felt the weight of O'Brien's words. She'd never revealed herself, never claimed credit for sparking the investigation, but in that moment, she felt seen in a way that transcended physical recognition. The trial continued for another week. Expert witnesses, character testimony, procedural arguments, but everyone knew the verdict was inevitable. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their decision. Guilty on 17 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, racketeering, kidnapping, and torture. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following week and remanded Battaglia to custody pending that hearing. As the bailiffs led him away, Battaglia's eyes swept the courtroom one final time, landing briefly on Vivian in the back row. For a moment, their gazes locked, and she saw in his expression not anger, but a kind of resigned acknowledgement. He'd been beaten, and he knew it. More importantly, he knew exactly who'd beaten him. Vivian allowed herself the smallest smile. Then she stood and walked out of the courthouse into a Chicago afternoon that felt cleaner somehow, as if the spring rain had washed away some of the city's accumulated filth. But she knew this wasn't over. Battaglia was convicted, but not destroyed. The outfit was weakened but not broken, and the families who'd lost members to his basement were circling, waiting for their own justice to be served. The reckoning wasn't complete. It was just beginning. Salvatore Battaglia was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Judge Morrison, in his sentencing remarks, called the crimes an affront to human decency and noted that the systematic nature of the torture demonstrated a depravity beyond the capacity of ordinary criminality. Battaglia stood silently through the hearing, showing no emotion, and was transferred immediately to Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison 30 miles outside Chicago. The newspapers declared it a victory for justice. The state's attorney gave speeches about the rule of law prevailing over organized crime. Police commissioners promised that the investigation was just beginning, that every member of Battaglia's organization would face consequences. But in the streets where the actual power resided, a different narrative was unfolding. The Chicago Outfit's ruling council met 3 days after sentencing in a private dining room at the Italian Club on Taylor Street. The meeting was closed door, but Vivian heard about it through Enzo, whose cousin worked as a waiter there. The message delivered to Battaglia's remaining capos was simple and brutal. The Battaglia organization was finished. All territories would be redistributed. All soldiers would be absorbed into other crews or dismissed, and anyone who objected would be treated as part of the problem that needed solving. The purge began quietly. Tommy the Hammer Rizzo disappeared first. His body was found a week later in the trunk of a car abandoned at O'Hare Airport. Paulie Greco fled to Las Vegas but was killed in an apparent car accident 6 weeks after his arrival. Vincent, the enforcer who'd spoken so admiringly about Battaglia's methods, was shot outside his home in Cicero, executed while his wife watched from the living room window. One by one, the men who'd staffed Battaglia's empire and participated in his horrors were eliminated. Not by police action, but by the same system that had supported them. The outfit was cleaning house, removing everyone tainted by association with a boss who'd brought unprecedented law enforcement attention to Chicago's organized crime operations. By September, 17 of Battaglia's key associates were dead or missing. The symmetry wasn't lost on Vivian. 17 victims in the basement, 17 executioners now executed themselves. She didn't know if the outfit had deliberately structured it that way or if it was simply coincidence, but the poetic justice felt appropriate. What surprised her was the organization's restraint regarding herself. She'd been visible at the trial, and certainly someone in the outfit must have deduced her role in Battaglia's downfall. Yet no one approached her. No threats materialized. It was as if she'd been deemed irrelevant, a civilian who'd gotten caught in mob business but wasn't worth the effort of revenge. Or perhaps they respected what she'd done. Respected the audacity of a woman systematically destroying a made man using nothing but intelligence and patience. In a culture that valued power above morality, she demonstrated power in its purest form. Carlo Benedetti survived the purge by virtue of being in federal protective custody. He was relocated to Arizona under a new identity, his sentence reduced to time served in exchange for his testimony. Vivian never saw him again, but she read about him occasionally in news reports about organized crime trials where his testimony helped secure convictions. He'd become what Marco Santini had briefly attempted, a man who'd chosen conscience over loyalty. The difference was that Carlo had the institutional protection that Marco lacked. Battaglia himself lasted 9 months at Stateville before his natural life sentence was shortened dramatically. The official story was that he'd been killed in a prison riot, caught in the crossfire between rival gangs fighting over cafeteria territory. The unofficial story, whispered in bars and social clubs across Chicago, was that the outfit had paid $5,000 to have him shanked in the exercise yard, the blade striking 37 times before guards intervened. Vivian felt nothing when she heard about his death. No satisfaction, no relief, just a distant acknowledgement that the story had reached its logical conclusion. Battaglia had lived by violence and died by it, and his final moments probably involved the same terror he'd inflicted on 17 people in his basement laboratory. The city moved on with the rapid amnesia of places accustomed to violence. New bosses emerged to fill the vacuum Battaglia left. New operations began in new territories. The Chicago outfit restructured, adapted, continued operating as it had for decades and would for decades more. One monster's death didn't change the fundamental nature of a system that produced monsters. But for Vivian, something had changed. She'd discovered she could survive in a world of predators, not by becoming prey, but by becoming something they didn't recognize. A threat that looked like vulnerability, a weapon disguised as decoration. She'd documented horror, deployed information strategically, and orchestrated the destruction of an empire using nothing but memory and patience. She'd proven that being underestimated was the most powerful position of all. By December 1951, nearly 2 years after she'd first walked into Battaglia's penthouse, Vivian Rossi had vanished into Chicago's population of ordinary citizens. She worked at the bookstore in Hyde Park, lived in a modest apartment, dated occasionally, attended church on Sundays. To anyone observing her, she was unremarkable, another young woman getting by in a city that devoured the weak and celebrated the strong. But late at night, alone in her apartment, Vivian would open the hidden panel behind her bathroom mirror and remove the journal she'd kept throughout her ordeal. She'd read through the entries, remembering every detail of every crime she'd witnessed, and then she'd add a final notation to the very last page. They said I couldn't remember. They were wrong. This is how a forgotten woman brought down a monster and walked away. This is how revenge looks when served cold and patient. This is how the decorative became deadly. Let anyone who underestimates women read this and learn. She sealed the journal in a waterproof container and buried it in Lincoln Park beneath an oak tree that had witnessed a century of Chicago's history. Maybe someday someone would find it. Maybe the truth would emerge decades later, when everyone involved was long dead. Or maybe it would stay buried, like so many secrets in a city built on secrets. Either way, Vivian Rossi had survived. And survival, she'd learned, was the ultimate form of justice. 23 years later, in August 1974, a construction crew breaking ground for a new community center in Lincoln Park unearthed something unexpected. A metal box buried 3 feet deep, badly corroded but intact. Inside was a journal, its pages yellowed and water-stained but still legible, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved the text despite decades underground. The journal found its way to a Chicago Tribune reporter named Sarah Chen, who specialized in cold cases and historical crime stories. She spent 3 months verifying the information it contained, cross-referencing dates with old newspaper archives, tracking down witnesses who'd been peripherally involved in the Battaglia trial, consulting with retired law enforcement officials who remembered the case. Everything checked out. The journal's author never identified herself by name, but the details were unmistakable. A mistress who'd documented the crimes of Salvatore Battaglia with meticulous precision, who'd sparked the investigation that led to his conviction, who'd orchestrated one of the most spectacular falls from power in Chicago, organized crime history. Chen published a series of articles in October 1974, titled "The Woman Who Remembered: How an Anonymous Witness Brought Down the Battaglia Empire." The story captivated Chicago, spinning myths about the mysterious woman who defeated a mob boss through sheer intelligence. Theories proliferated about her identity, her fate, her motivations, but no one ever confirmed who she was. The few people who might have known, Enzo, Frank, Maria, were either dead or declined to comment. The outfit, by then under different leadership, showed no interest in reopening old wounds. And the woman herself, if she still lived, never came forward to claim credit. Vivian Rossi, who by then was 63 years old, living in Oregon under her married name, with 3 grown children who knew nothing of her past, read the articles with a small, satisfied smile. She'd kept her promise to herself. She'd documented everything, ensured the truth survived, and walked away without ever needing recognition. Being seen wasn't the same as being acknowledged. Being remembered was power enough. She cut out the articles, placed them in an envelope, and wrote a single sentence across the front: "For my daughters, to be opened after my death." Then she returned to her life, ordinary, unremarkable, exactly what she'd fought so hard to claim, knowing that someday when she was gone, her daughters would learn that their quiet mother, who'd worked in bookstores and baked cookies and attended PTA meetings, had once been the most dangerous person in Chicago's underworld, not because she carried guns or commanded soldiers, but because she'd remembered everything. And in a world of men who believed women were decorative and forgettable, memory had been the deadliest weapon of all.